Welcome back to the Side Chat Podcast. This week we're going to talk about Canada. Something that a lot of you have requested. It seemed to be a lot of Canadians that request this for some reason.
Our friendly neighbors up north, hello.
Um, so we're going to talk about the Great Maple Syrup Crash of 1939. I'm kidding.
The Great Maple Syrup Heist of 2013.
Yeah. Anyway, so Canada played a somewhat, I guess we'll call it, significant role. I did a lot of research. I'm not a Canadian expert, so if I say something wrong, I'm just trying to paint a picture. It's really hard to try to smash in what one nation did in a war that took 4 or 5 years into 30, 45 minutes, but we're going to really try. So bear with us if we mess something up. I tried to cross source as much of this information as possible. But I thought I'd break into three sections. We'll talk about the kind of the political atmosphere, the ground forces, the air, and the naval independently, because they all kind of did different things in the theaters. So basically, real quickly, start with this. Canada and World War One was a conscription-based army, and their big reserve about helping Britain right off the bat with World War Two was that they did not want to do another war with that conscription model base. So they had a little bit of like a week delay when Britain declared war. So Britain declared war on Germany after Poland fell, and then they called for the colonies to, or the Commonwealth to declare war as well. But Canada had to take a week to figure out what they were going to do, and
They got lost in the woods.
they had to ride on horseback anyway. Sorry. So one thing I did not know when I was doing this research was that Canada was only 11 million people at the time. It's actually, even though it's a huge piece of land, it was actually a pretty small population back then. And about 1 million of those people served between 39 and 45. So that's 11th of their population served in the military. That's a pretty big chunk of your population gone.
A huge amount of people.
Um, they had 42,000 total casualties, which I think Canada. It's kind of hard to explain. Every time I look into a Canadian battle, their soldiers weren't bad, or not saying they're inept, but they seem to suffer a lot of casualties. And usually, unfortunately, they were kind of given, it seems like, the harder missions or the harder objectives. Some of them would be like Juno Beach or other things in Italy we'll talk about in a minute. There's that one town, too, that they got, I can't think of off the top of my head. You know what I'm talking about? In France, didn't they invade a town in northern France that
Yeah,
they...
yeah. Way early in the war, too, and it
Yeah,
was an absolutely miserable failure.
yeah, so... Um, no, nothing disrespect, but it seemed like Canada just kind of got the shit missions, it seemed like a lot.
Yeah.
So like I said, they declared war, and one of the first things they did was they wanted to see action in Africa, but so some of the Navy got there early. But we're going to talk about the Army first, and the Army served under. They put together what's basically called the First Canadian Infantry Division, and it saw action in Sicily as part of the British Eighth Army. And this is a pretty fascinating group. They basically fought from Sicily all the way up to mainland Italy and helped broke through with Patton and the British. And try to say they took heavy casualties. They had 92,000, called 93,000 troops in Italy. They lost 5,700 of those in that campaign.
That's quite a lot. Wow.
But something I want to talk about real quick that a lot of people don't know about, and I've mentioned this, Cobey's never heard of it, was there was a group called the Black Devils. So hopefully, if this is all, if you knew about this before, maybe you've never heard of this. There's a group called the Black Devils, and the U.S. and Canada was kind of jealous of what the SAS were doing with sabotage or sapping commando units. And so the U.S. wanted to put one together, and U.S. and Canada got together and made what's called the Black Devils to kind of be the rival to the Red Devils. That's kind of the joke anyway. And so they made this little commando school. They learned things like explosives, stabbing people with knives, jumping out of airplanes, learned a lot of mountaineering skills. And they also, I believe, they learned skiing of all things. So they kind of just did a whole boot camp of being badasses, and then they were deployed onto the mountains overlooking Italy because the Germany and Italy defenses were really built on the cliff sides. And so they, of course, put all their guns and stuff and their machine guns facing the roads, up the mountain. And they wouldn't think no idiots would climb a almost straight sheer cliff face, except for the Black Devils. And that's what they did. They climb up at night, and they made attacks. And they took a lot of casualties themselves, because that seems to be the reigning theme of this. But they did a lot of damage from the rear flank. So, just thought I'd throw out there. Just Google them. If you never heard of them, Black Devils. It's kind of an interesting squad. and I believe they saw some action in the Pacific here and there, but kind of a neat little commando group that I never heard of until recently. After the first division was done, and with Italy, they were rejoined. This is when Canada kind of got full force into the war, and the first division was rejoined with the First Canadian Army to be part of the D-Day invasion. Like I said, we mentioned Cobey. If you want to talk more about that town, fucking move my paper.
Yeah, it was. I forgot it. I think it was in 1943 when they did it. 1942. It was very early in the war in Dieppe, and
What's it called?
we attempted to
Papai or
invade.
Pepe or whatever the fuck that town is. I think that's
Yeah,
the
it's
name of it.
Dieppe. I think is what it's
I can't.
called.
Dieppe. Sorry, I can't read
Dieppe
my
or
own
something
writing.
like
Yeah,
that.
Dieppe. There we go. Pepe. I don't know.
I'm sorry, I don't speak French.
Yeah.
But we tried to invade France just kind of as a just to see what would happen. We sent in the Canadians in this little coastal town, and they just got fucking slaughtered, just absolutely slaughtered. The Germans were ready for them, and I think that's probably one of the main contributors of why we went to why we invaded at Normandy and not at Calais, which is right across the channel. Yeah, I don't know. It was an absolutely horrible, horrible, horrible turn of events for the Canadian Army.
It was a bad idea, but they got cut off. To my knowledge, they also didn't. They could not. We could not get Allied support to them fast enough.
Yeah,
Like they
it
were
was
just.
absolutely horrible. It was just a comedy of errors from the beginning.
And then we come to the Normandy invasion, and I believe Canada had some units that mixed in with the Royal Army, but I know that I think it was the first actually had Juno Beach. I believe that's correct. I believe they had Juno Beach sectioned off for them, and then they supported other units throughout. But I believe Juno Beach was primarily a Canadian invasion, if I remember correctly. They saw very, very bitter fighting there, and then they actually bitter fighting, and they broke up into town. Like I said, if you watch, was it Longest Day had a scene from that, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So anyway, if you want to see that movie, but one of the neat things I'll mention real quick is that the Canadians had this. I know Americans had some too, but the Canadians are famous for this. They had a Sherman that had basically like a watertight skirt around it with a propeller. That was supposed to be like an amphibious Sherman, and it didn't do very well because it was very slow. Well, they tested it like in ponds or lakes, because
Yeah, they tested it in still water.
yeah, and then they didn't think about currents, waves, being shot at, and then like I think like how I don't know how many of them. I think 7 sank just due to fucking a wave tipping over. It was not pretty.
Yeah, actually, I think the vast majority of them didn't even make it to the beach. There's a spot off in Normandy there where you can actually dive down, and there's an entire row of them just sunk. They were sunk immediately as soon as they got off the LSTs.
Well, the best part too is that the poor engineer or whoever the commander is, like somebody had to get out of the fucking tank and roll down this apron on the beach to get the tracks. Like you couldn't just drive with it too. It was not good.
Sure enough, yeah, crazy.
It was not good. So to my knowledge, like I said, the British kind of supported. It's like it's hard to talk about British because like I said, they did a lot of supporting to the Royal Army, and they helped the Americans here and there. The biggest battle I know for the Canadians was the Battle of the Rhineland, which is I've watched a documentary on it, and it's kind of hard to get some. At least I don't know. It's hard to find information for this thing. It was part of Operation Blockbuster, which I know is talked about a lot in the States, at least from American history, because we bombed the living shit out of everything in Operation Blockbuster. You know much about Blockbuster? Or?
Nope.
All right, whatever. And then there was Operation Vertibird, which is part of that whole. The two operations went together. So anyway, the one battle story that I do know of is that the Canadians had a bunch of, I believe they were Sherman Fireflies, and their job was to push through the Rhineland. Of course, that's why it's Battle of the Rhineland. Push through the German defenses. And one thing, and this is one thing the ground forces doesn't do very well, is most of the fighting in Europe after Normandy. The terrain in Europe was not very good. Because most of it was flooded or it was just wet from nature, and it was dirt roads. And dirt, like if you ever lived on a dirt road in your life, dirt roads don't hold up well to cars. Imagine a shit ton of tanks traveling up and down them. So the roads were just shit, and they were almost impassable. So the Canadians had to go through the marshy, wet fields, and it was just very slow going. And the Germans, of course, lined up the entire, wood lines with 88mm anti-tank guns, and the poor Fireflies just had no chance, and it was a pretty bad ambush. There's one story, it's kind of funny of not funny, but of a Sherman Firefly. He saw everybody dying around him, and him and his commander ordered it to go into a barn, and they just sat in the barn as everybody kind of died around them, and then the barn exploded, and they're like, okay, time to go, and they drove off, and that's how they escaped.
Oh.
Yeah, it's a crazy, absolute crazy, but they actually did end up winning that. It was just that initial attack just went once again bad for Canada, but they did persevere through it. That battle had over 200,000 British and Canadians involved in it, 90,000 Germans. The Germans ended up having 44,000 casualties. So you just want to talk about an all-out just brawl. The Commonwealth lost 15,000 troops. So just that's insane. That's a large amount of casualties. So, you know anything else with the the Canadian Army?
No, not too much. You know, they were in with the Commonwealth, so they were under British control, I believe, for most of the war. So I don't know. It's kind of hard to describe.
Yeah, it's hard to like single them out because
But,
they're always mixed
yeah.
in with the British here and there. So, like I said, the
It's
Battle
not
of the
very good
Rhineland is a
information
famous
on
British operation, and Juno Beach is another one, and so on in Italy. So, those are the only ones that could really stick out. I'm sure you guys probably know more stories, but those are the three I thought were most important to cover. They were actually, I think the RCAF was more powerful than probably the Canadian Army.
Well, I think they contributed more to the war.
Yeah, they
effort than
contributed a
Canadian
lot in the
Army
air.
did.
So they had 152 aces total, which I didn't. I thought that was actually pretty impressive for them. They started out by contributing pilots to the actual RAF during Battle of Britain, and after that, the RCAF. I don't believe the RCAF was officially deployed over there, right? It was just
Well, just like the army, it was part of the Commonwealth, so
right.
there were units within the British RAF
But all the
that
Canadian pilots were
were
pulled into
Canadian.
RAF command. They weren't given their
Yeah,
own individual
that's
squadrons, I
correct.
believe.
Yes. Yeah. Well, there might have been some individual
Eventually,
squadrons. I don't
eventually,
know.
but
Yeah.
not all the Canadian pilots I studied have always been thrown underneath some type of British leadership or wing. So the Canadians went over there. They went over there in boats, and they became part of the. Most of them went. A lot of the early ones trained under the RAF, and then later when the RCAF came in force, they transferred back to the RCAF. So they actually enlisted with the RAF, and then they got transferred to the Royal Canadian Air Force. So, kind of like it's got to be a paperwork nightmare, but I guess back then you did what you had to. They had here's kind of something interesting. They had 48 squadrons by the end of the war. The most famous one is the number 6 RCAF bomber group, which had 14 squadrons, and a whole hell of a lot of casualties were involved in that thing. They were part of actually 10,000 of the fucking casualties of the 42,000 of that war came from number 6 bomber group. Which I just found that's atrocious, isn't it?
Yeah, that's ridiculous.
Well, how many B-17 casualties do we have?
I have no idea. A lot.
Yeah. But I believe the Canadians use mostly Lancasters, right? Almost exclusively.
They probably use Lancasters and Wellingtons more than anything else. Yeah. Lancaster, actually, both Lancasters that are still flying today were both made in Canada.
So, anyway, I just thought that was interesting. Like I said, Canadian squadrons did a lot of escorting for the bombers, for their bombers and for the British bombers. And then they saw action in like I said, UK. Some Canadian pilots saw action in the Battle of Britain or in Channel Defense after that. Some went to North Africa, Italy, Northwest Europe, Southeast Asia. Anywhere the Commonwealth was, they went along with it. Some of the more interesting stuff I learned about, though, when I was doing this research for this podcast was that the RCAF did a ton, and probably their best contribution was the anti-submarine operations and the convoy protection. And basically, they ran all the Atlantic coast side anti-submarine missions. They sank over 20 submarines with their airplanes. And a little fact I didn't know about, they helped out with the U.S. forces with the Aleutian Islands. They lent some pilots and squadrons to that against the Japanese. So the friendly Canadian neighbors just were there wherever they were needed in any capacity. I will talk about one Canadian ace at the end of the podcast, but like I said, this is just kind of a brief abbreviation of everything Canada when it comes to war. I know it's so hard to bring in all this. We jumped to the Canadian Navy. They went from a very, very tiny Navy. This is probably either their air was the biggest contribution or the Navy was. I still can't figure it out. But they went from a tiny little Navy to 471 fighting ships with over 100,000 men. Their primary
Pretty
role was
impressive.
convoy protection. They also helped in North Africa with the supply lines and with the fighting against Italy. And they also lent 110 fighting vessels for the D-Day invasion. They lost 24 ships in total. And I thought it was funny. They lost a ship called the HMS Raccoon, the HMCS Raccoon, which was a armed yacht, little 35-person yacht that was meant for anti-submarine missions. It sank in the St. Lawrence River.
Oops.
Yeah, so the Germans got them on their home turf on that one.
So it was sunk by a U-boat?
Yeah, U-boat came up St. Lawrence and got
Wow.
them. All 37 crew members were killed.
Well, that sucks. Poor people.
But the Canadians did a lot of convoy protection, which probably freed up a lot of the U.S. I mean, God, that's all we. I don't know how much of the Atlantic Fleet got tied up with convoy protection for us, and
Or most of it. In fact, probably, yeah, about 90% of it.
until the
was
wolf packs,
stuff that
yeah,
was
until
down
the wolf packs
Caribbean.
could have been broken apart.
Yeah, well, that was due to air cover from both sides. You know, the Atlantic Wall. It wasn't really called the Atlantic Wall, but there was a wall out there. There was an area out there where no patrol planes could reach on either side, and that's where the U-boats just hunted. Like a 500-mile gap there. Finally, it got covered, but due to the escort carriers,
The Canadians used Mossies too for that, right?
they used everything. Yeah, they used B-24s. They pretty much used everything. They had B-24s, B-17s,
Yeah, let's stick on the air real quick
Lancasters.
though. They produced, I know, they had a de Havilland factory in Canada, right?
Yep, still do.
Okay, so that's still open, and they produced a Mosquito there. They produced Lancasters in Canada. There was no Canadian made Spitfires, were they?
No, I don't
I don't
believe
think
so.
so.
No, no. They made a bunch of training airplanes too. Remember the Canada was the biggest spot for pilot training for the Commonwealth for the majority of the war. So a lot of trainers were built there. T6s and which are Harvards and airspeed Oxfords and all that stuff like that. A bunch of weird British airplanes.
All right. So, okay. So moving on. Oh, that real quick. We'll talk about the what Canada produced, and we'll talk about two famous Canadians. Canada produced a shit ton of goods. A lot of it just went straight to the British. They produced a lot of ships, like I mentioned. They produced a ton of Lancasters, which I believe a lot of the British used Lancasters were produced in the Canada, or let's say I don't know how many of the Canadians left, but most of the to my knowledge, most of the Canadian manufactured Lancasters went over to the RAF, right?
Yep.
And so they were sold kind of like I guess it was their version of Lend Lease. I don't know or they just sold it outright.
Oh, uh, I don't know. It's hard to describe with the Commonwealth. It's kind of it's weird the way it was set up during the war. India did the same thing. They contributed everything at no cost to the British
Um,
because they kind of had to.
yeah, they built 815,000, basically 816,000 military vehicles. Most of those went to the British, and they gave $3 billion in financial aid, just in cash. So
Wow, that's a lot.
that is a lot for Canada. So Canada really helped save Britain's ass in this one. Um, so two famous Canadians before we wrap this up, and unless you have anything else you want to add. These are two guys that have quite a bit of myth around them, and I'm not going to say, oh, these were the best fighters in World War. These are just two Canadian. When you bring up Canada in World War II, these are two people that I point to as interesting figures. I don't know. Some of them call them liars. Some of it call it myth. Some of it I don't know. Anyway, first one is Brad Walters, and he was a tank commander. He was an unconfirmed tank ace. It is believed that he might have had up to 18 kills. He had 3 tanks shot underneath him, and he was wounded twice. He was there, I believe, for the D-Day invasion, and he was responsible for a bunch of Panther kills with a bunch of different variations of the Sherman. I believe he started one of the smaller tanks, too, one of the smaller British tanks. But that's another one of where people are, like, if you go back and look at historically, there's like 3 other Shermans that claim to get that kill. You know what I mean? So it's always like, I shot that tank. No, I shot that tank. No, I shot that tank. But
Mhm.
if you survive losing 3 tanks, you're fucking pretty hardy motherfucker. Like,
Crazy.
yeah, you climb out with 3 tanks that were shot out from underneath you. You're pretty badass. Probably some guy from fucking Alberta who didn't know how to fucking, you know.
We out there, don't you
Yeah.
know?
That wasn't very nice. Um, but the other one I'm going to talk about quite a bit is George Burling. Um, who, like, whenever I mention this to people, if you know anything about George Burling, there's either like a positive reaction or you hate the guy. And I think he's just a fascinating figure. I've read about 10 or so articles, watched 2 documentaries, and everything conflicts with this guy. It's so hard to actually get a real accurate picture of who he was. So I'm just gonna try to do like I guess we'll call it a abbreviation of the information that is available out there. Some of the, like I said, some of this could be completely fake. Some of it could be true. So there's probably some truth in here, mostly lies, or most truth. I don't know. So he was a Canadian who tried to enlist in the U.S. Army first, because I believe the RCAF was too small at the time, and they weren't hiring or they weren't enlisting pilots at the time. So he was shut down there for his grades. He crossed over into New York. He was arrested, I know, for a couple weeks, and then shipped back to Canada. Then he went over to the RAF and tried to enlist there. His grades were too bad, and he didn't have his birth certificate, so they sent his ass back. He came back with the birth certificate to the same recruiter like a week later, and they're like, okay, whatever, you're in. So he was finally got in. He he I don't know how to explain this guy. He had an obsession with airplanes. That was pretty much one thing that was noted about him, was he had a constant obsession with airplanes. He did nothing but watch airplanes in the air at the local airport, and that's all he wanted to do. And I think he got over there in like late 41. I think he started flying in I think he got his wings in 42. If I remember right, I think September 42 is when he got his wings. He got the nickname Buzz because you could probably figure that one out without me explaining it, Kobe.
The city and what?
His nickname was Buzz. You can probably figure out where he got that nickname from.
Because he liked to buzz airfields, even though
Yeah.
he was told that the pattern was full by the guy
Yes,
drinking his
repeatedly. He actually did it several times with the trainer, his training officer in the back seat, who I think there was one quote I was reading. The guy said, "Oh God, we're dead. This is it," because he went basically straight down from like 1,000 feet to 100 feet and pulled up in a Spitfire. And the training officer basically, just shat his pants. And so he got written up for that. He also loved to basically he'd come in over the rugby fields where people were playing rugby and dive over the goalpost down and then back up over the goalpost and see how many people hit the deck. And then he was also known for harassing cattle and farm in the fields around the air bases. He'd just go chase cows with his Spitfire. Anyway, so British High Command wasn't too crazy about this. It's very un-British. And so when he got into the air, he didn't fit in. It's hard to explain. He did not fit in at well with his other pilots, just from a personality standpoint. The guy was kind of a sociopath in a lot of ways that you look at him. He shot a lot of animals around the base for no reason, just because he wanted to practice like deflection shooting. So he was shooting birds, shooting rabbits. He would not basically he wasn't hunting them. He was just killing them, and it was just kind of off. He was always kind of off. When he was deployed in Malta, he was famous for just shooting lizards with his revolver. He'd just sit out there and just all day just shoot animals. So, it's a little cuckoo in the head probably. When he flew with the RAF doing basically channel defense after the Battle of Britain, he was put on Tell and Charlie because he was the newest pilot and they didn't like him. And you want to explain Tell and Charlie in the British formation?
Alan Charlie was the guy in the back end who had all the luck, or didn't have any luck at all. Poor bastard.
He was literally bait. He was literally out there as bait. And you were supposed to hold that position at all cost. First time he did it, his plane got shot up, and I believe he got his first confirmed 190 kill. Here's the problem, though, with George Burling. He claims he got a 190 kill, even though his cannons were damaged. And he might have gotten it, but there was, once again, no evidence. And the Germans have no history of an airplane being lost that day. So that's where the history gets a little fuzzy with this guy. Second time he went out with them, he saw something. They didn't see it. And this is something I'll explain real quick. George Burling had a very unique skill early on. And you'll probably know this, Cobey. When you search for airplanes, it's very easy. Basically what George Burling did was he did a lot of scanning left to right. All he would do is kind of look for motion. All he would do is just roll his eyes left to right across the sky. If you want to explain that, or if you ever heard that.
Yeah, it's actually easier to do that. Well, the human eye is set up to view horizontally to begin with, because we're hunters, and the human eye is also trained to see movement, not color. That's why camouflage is somewhat effective, but movement is what we see primarily. So if you keep it in focus left to right, you're more apt to see something move than up and down.
When did pilots start picking up on that?
I don't know. That's a good question.
Because everything I've heard,
probably during the First World War.
well, because everything I heard about George Burling was that he was one of the few pilots that like mastered this. And I don't know if, like I said, this is just, I don't know if this is Burling propaganda, but he was famous for just sitting there and just looking side to side, you know, the entire flight. Anyway, he saw 190s. Nobody else saw them. They told him whatever, and he just took off after them, disappeared. The rest of the wing landed. He claimed he got another kill. They got it back to base. They loaded up the gun camera footage. There was nothing there. And the problem with Burling's kills in the gun camera is if he actually did get these kills, his deflection shots were so extreme. The camera was facing forward, but his deflection shots were at weird angles, so they never saw the aircraft when he shot.
I believe it.
But there was no reported airplanes missing from the, Luftwaffe records. So once again, is he lying? Anyway, that's the mystery of Burling. He got sick of the office. He got sick of everybody at the RAF, and one of the married officers was going to get shipped out to Malta. He said, basically, fuck all you guys. I want to go fight Malta. And he took that, he forcefully took that, what's it called? Deployment, I guess we'll call it. I don't know what the fuck I was going to say, that job position, but that's not fucking, it's not, anyway, temp service. Anyway, so this is, we're going to talk a little bit about Malta. Malta was under siege when he got there, and they had to fly the Spitfires in from carriers, which the Spitfire, this is not a Sea Spitfire, this was a Spitfire 5B. They weren't meant to be taken off carriers, and Spitfire's flaps have two settings, either landing or up.
Up or down, that's
right,
it.
and so they needed flaps to get off the carrier, so they actually shoved wedges in between the flaps to keep them at like half open, and then they would drop the flaps all the way down, the wedge would fall out, and then they pull it up. So that's a little trick to get the Spitfire off the carriers. They had to fly in through the siege, and as Burling landed, I think they lost 2 or 3 from the initial flight in already. They just lost 2 or 3 planes and pilots just trying to fucking get into Malta. Burling landed his aircraft, and he was yanked out of the cockpit, and somebody jumped in, and the plane went off. And that's how badly they needed Spitfires. The thing to even like get, fuel, ammo, and then him out, new pilot in, go.
Wow.
That's how desperate Malta was at the situation. I'm going to real quickly try to talk about abbreviated version of Malta, because this is about Canada, but this is, I think, one of the most important Canadian pilots. He killed a lot of motherfuckers in Malta. It's insane. Like, just Google him, and I think he killed like 25 people in Malta. Some of the days there's like 5 kills a day at some points. The guy just went nuts, and he was one of the first ones to load stealth ammunition. Like, he didn't need the tracer rounds, and so he had his poor armorer sit there and pull out all the tracer rounds and reload the normal AP rounds. He has the furthest kill with furthest confirmed Spitfire kill with a 303 British at 800 yards. He took down a 109 with a British 303. That is, I believe, confirmed, and that's pretty fucking impressive right there. If you look for his like total kill count throughout the war, you're going to see like sometimes 30, 30 and a third, 31, 35. I just call it 30. Let's just call it 31, I guess. I don't know. That's, once again, what's fact, what's fiction with this guy. He's famous for killing I believe it was a colonel. Trying to find out now. I think I have my notes somewhere. I'm trying to look for it. I believe he killed an Italian colonel, or one of the higher up officers, who killed his wingman, if I remember right, and Burling basically decapitated the guy. There was another lower officer, I believe, with the colonel at the time, or captain. It might have been a captain. That guy got shot down. I believe he was put in a prisoner of war camp, and I think he was killed after the war for war crimes or something. I don't know. Anyway, Burling had 2 high profile takedowns of Italian officers, which is kind of how he became famous besides killing everything in Malta. The one thing I want to point out real quickly, I believe he was shot down 2 or 3 times in Spitfires. He had the bail, was picked up by boats, and then brought back to Malta, got a new Spitfire. And he had dysentery the entire time he was there because they were basically eating like boiled rats.
Yum.
Yeah, so he had dysentery. He was either shitting his pants or he was killing Italians. I don't know. It's guys just I don't know how like how do you deal with that? I don't know how you like man, you get the flu and you can barely drive a car, right? How the fuck do you fly an
Yeah, you
airplane?
can barely get out of bed, let alone
Yeah, how the
go
fuck
on
do
and
you
kill
fly an
Germans.
airplane? Anyway, so after the war, George Burling's life got kind of sad. He got transferred back to the RCAF, where I believe he did mostly escort flying. Never saw any action. Drove him insane. Like I said, he was just a boring killer. I think that's all he wanted to do was kill. And he requested to go with the RAF again. They denied him. He wanted to be part of like the what are they called? What were the pilots who went deep into Germany at the time called? Not invasion. Interdiction, was that the term?
Yeah.
Interdiction pilots. He badly wanted to be put into that unit, and then they wouldn't. So he multiple times he requested for a be transferred over to the U.S. Army Air Corps. Of course, the Canadians weren't just going to give him away. So I mean, the guy was just nothing but a problem to command, and he had a bad reputation because of all these little things. Like I said, the shoot downs, the losing of aircraft, the constant buzzing, the problem with officers. He was wounded multiple times. So after the war, no commercial airline would go near him. They all knew the story of him. They were afraid. Quote, I think I was reading the quote from one of the Canadian archives from .gov, was that they were afraid of giving him any type of commercial equipment or lives in his hands because they were afraid of what he was going to do with a commercial airliner full of people.
That was his demise, wasn't
it? Yeah, he was in 19, I think it was 47. He was found begging on the streets of Montreal or somewhere for money. He died in 48 after he was flying with a U.S. ace. I don't know what the hell they were doing out there, but he was out in the Middle East, and him and his friend were on a plane. It took off, the engine died, it spun over, and it crashed and blew up. And that was the end of George Burling, 1948. So pretty short life. That whole crash is suspected in sabotage. I've read many different stories. People think it was sabotage. Some of it think it was payback for those Italian officers being murdered, or a loved one. I mean, when you kill 36 people, let's say, somebody probably holds a grudge against you somewhere. And he was a pretty public figure. Another story is that the pilot flying the plane was not trained or familiar with that aircraft, and so it just could have been pilot error or maintenance error, who knows. But like I said, that one kill, though, 730 meters with a British 303 is still quite impressive. And then, I don't know where to go from there with that. I think...
that's really it. Canada, you did a great service to everyone during the war. You got the short end of the stick most of the time. Sorry for that.
Yeah, the Canadian Army saw hell, but they still won, I think, almost every conflict they were in, besides the one French town. For such a small nation, it really helped a lot. I think they knew they weren't going to be a primary, they weren't going to take the lead in anything, but they did a great job of supporting with goods, money, and as much men as they could possibly give in a lot of ways. So, better than a lot of other Western Hemisphere countries that we had over here.
Yep.
We'll just say that. So I think that'll probably be it for this podcast. I will try to put out in the next day or two my 1.43 review. I know a lot of you have been asking for that. And then also, real quickly, the Steam group, I mentioned that a couple times. We're running our first, of course, this podcast won't be out in time, but tonight we'll be running our first community event. So if you want to join us, we're doing air races tonight. We'll probably try to do some more events. So just click on the Boat Time Steam group if you want to be notified when we're going to be running community events.
You're going to put a link in the bottom of the description?
Yep, I will. So anyway, thanks for listening. If you have any comments or anything we missed, please try. We're just two, dumbass Americans talking about Canada. All I know about Canada is you have great fishing and bears and moose.
All I know about Canada is that Boston Pizza, Swiss Chalet, Timmy's is the best thing in the whole entire world. I want a double and some Tim Bites, please. And go Leafs.
All right, catch you next time.
Yes, I am a Leafs
Jesus
fan.
Christ, it's enough of the hockey.